Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Federalist Files. I'll be covering Federalist number 44. It is titled Restrictions on the Authority of the Several States, written by James Madison, January 25th, 1788. Topics include no bill of attainder, no ex post facto laws, prohibition of standing military in states, prohibition of state currencies, prohibition of titles of nobility, and supremacy of the Constitution. Now, this one, in a general sense, it lays out a couple things that are in the Constitution, and then it kind of goes into other state regulations that were in the Articles of Confederation, and now where this power has shifted to the Union in the proposed Constitution. So he starts off this paper, and this is going to be the very last one about. I knew the last video I did, I said this might be the last one about the federal powers. I believe this is actually the last one of the federal powers, outlining the fifth class of the federal power in the Constitution. So he starts off, he states, and I quote, "No state shall enter into any treaty, alliance, or confederation, grant letters of marque and reprisal, coin money, emit bills of credit, make anything but gold and silver a legal tender in payment of debts, pass any bill of attainder, ex post facto law, or law impairing the obligation of contracts, or grant any title of nobility," end quote. He's going to go over these a little bit. So just to start off, the prohibition of treaties having to do with states. States can't treat themselves. No state shall get into a treaty because we're supposed to be representative in the Union, the federal government. We're all supposed to be represented as a whole, so you can't have a treaty with a foreign country like Great Britain. New Jersey can't have a treaty with Great Britain and then New York not have that treaty. It has to be uniform. Thus, states cannot enter into treaties. Alliances, which is the same thing pretty much as a treaty. Confederations, they can't create their own federal government within our already made system. It's almost like another treaty or alliance amongst the states, though. Grant letters of marque, that has to do with armed sea vessels. It's the federal government now is going to be in charge of handing out licenses to do so, and that all has to do with the national security, obviously. And coin money, he gets a little complex. He gets into this a little bit. I'll save that for later. Emit bills of credit, which is get rid of the bills of credit for individuals, and this was important because of our lenders at that time. We still had to pay off the debt, and the state couldn't just get rid of the bill of credit. Make sure that anything, so the one thing amongst all of the coined money is before, I don't want to get too into it now, but the federal government was not really in charge of making the money. It was more the states individually, and then the federal government would kind of stand in the back and say how much each one was worth. And it didn't really make any sense because then it impeded a lot of commercial activity. Thus, that's why they get rid of it. What they do, they set a standard. The federal government's to coin the money, and the federal government also is to determine how valuable the money is, and then the states can do their thing. But the only thing that they were able to actually use as a legal tender of payment was gold and silver. That was still fine for states to do. Now, pass any bill of attainder, that is, and this is also a federal law for the federal government, you cannot detain somebody, you cannot arrest somebody based off of a bill that somehow passed through the legislative branch. It could be an innocent person. It doesn't even, at this point, honestly, if it's somebody that committed some sort of crime, it's still not the system that we have the Congress or we have the state legislature cite the bill to arrest this person. It's just not the way our system works. That's authoritarian in nature. That is how a lot of tyrannical dictators take their position. They just say, okay, I'm arrest this person, and you go, on what? I don't care. I'm the leader. Just arrest them. So ex post facto law is enacting some sort of law after the fact. So if it is legal, there's no type of provision for the illegality of crossing the street or jaywalking. Let's say just to be simple here, you walk across the street, you jaywalk. Then after you do that, 2 years later, the town comes out with an ordinance saying you can't jaywalk and you have to walk within the lines. And that's considered now an ex post facto law, and they arrest you for something you did 2 years ago. There's no such thing as that in America. In a general sense, whether it's the states, it's also the federal government. You cannot enact ex post facto law and then arrest people for doing something that wasn't illegal 2 years ago. Or law impairing the obligation of contracts. That kind of has the same thing to do with loaners, people that loan, creditors. or grant any title of nobility. That's in the federal constitution, having to do with the federal government as well as the states. No titles of nobility. So Madison, he explains that the prohibition of treaties is taken from the Articles of Confederation, as well as the prohibition of letters of marque. A bill of attainder is a document of the legislature declaring a person guilty of a crime, often without a trial, and a letter of marque is a license for an armed sea vessel, which in the Articles of Confederation, power was granted to the states after a declaration of war. So when it came to armed sea vessels, the states were actually giving out the licenses as long as the Congress assembled had declared war. This was state run. Now that's going to be federal run. So the reasoning behind these two provisions are because the founders believed in the inherent right to a free trial by jury in criminal cases. That's the reason for no bill of attainder. And it was not the job of the legislators to decide guilt or innocence. Now, as it pertains to the letters of marque, the licenses for the naval ships or the armed sea vessels, they asserted that the coast was to be protected by the federal navy and not one state. It was the federal navy's jurisdiction and their responsibility to protect the eastern seaboard or the coast there. So the prohibition of coining money is a new provision counter to that of the Articles of Confederation, in which states were able to coin money. So he explains this next. He states, and I quote, "The right of coining money, which is here taken from the states, was left in their hands by the Confederation as a concurrent right with that of Congress, under an exception in favor of the exclusive right of Congress to regulate the alloy and value. In this instance also, the new provision is an improvement on the old, whilst the alloy and value depended on the general authority. A right of coinage in the particular states could have no other effect than to multiply expensive mints and diversify the forms and weights of the circulating pieces." End quote. So his argument here is it impeded the flow of commerce, because you had to say, okay, well, this is the New Jersey dollar and this is the New York dollar. The translation is the New Jersey $1 of New Jersey dollars is only 50 cents over in New York. So that would impede the traffic. That would impede interstate commerce as well. It did not create for a free market or a free economy. And then also, if you have the federal government determining how much one is worth, how much the other one is, then you have to constantly change it's not the same all of the time. Maybe every single couple of days they needed to send out a paper saying what the translation was, what the equity was between one source of currency and another. It just was to me, it sounds like a complete mess. And it's kind of similar to how in the EU, in Europe, the only, I want to say Britain is the only one that has their own currency, the pound, and then the other ones have their different currencies, but most of them handle with euros. But I want to say like Portugal has like the Portugal euro or something like that. They're all different, and then there's euros. It's the same thing with South America too. It's just a giant pain if you're going to go from one country to another. And here, in our country, we have our set currency, and then that's it. And then when we go to other countries, I think there's the Canadian dollar is different or what have you, but at least you're in a different country. If you're in a different state here, then you don't have any issues with the source of currency. And he said it's the exclusive right of the Congress to regulate the alloy and the value, saying that the alloy meaning whatever type of metal they used to make the coin at that time, and the value of that coin. And before, the way it worked through the Confederation, the Articles of Confederation, the states were making their own money, coining it. And the Articles of Confederation, the Congress assembled, was determining how much it was worth. So in one state, they can really cause animosities and jealousies in different states, because in one state they could say, that dollar's worth 2 of your dollars in this state. And there's a lot of then there's a lot of inequality in terms of the value of one coin over another. And I don't know exactly what that was really built on. I don't know how you evaluate how much one is worth compared to another. It's very rudimentary. So this provision includes prohibition to bills of credit, which was considered paper money. Oh, that's what they meant when they meant bills of credit. So that was paper money as well. So they didn't want the states to use paper money either. The states pretty much had to adopt a federal source of currency, but they could still use silvers and golds to trade if they wanted to. And obviously other things. If you wanted to trade 2 of your chickens for one calf, that was also doable. That's completely fine. So he goes on. I think he gets a little deeper into this. He states, and I quote, "It may be observed that the same reasons which show the necessity of denying to the states the power of regulating coin prove with equal force that they ought not to be at liberty to substitute a paper medium in the place of coin. Had every state a right to regulate the value of its coin, there might be as many different currencies as states, and thus the intercourse among them would be impeded. Retrospective alterations in its value might be made, and thus the citizens of other states be injured and animosities be kindled among these states themselves. The power to make anything but gold and silver attainder in payment of debts is withdrawn from the states on the same principle with that of issuing a paper currency." End quote. So, pretty self-explanatory. I explained it all before. So next, Madison, he explains the prohibition of the bills of attainder, ex post facto laws, and laws impairing the obligation of contracts. Ex post facto law, just to once again, they're considered laws that are established after the fact. In other words, creating laws to criminally charge a person after they had committed an act that happened before the law's creation, and was not a crime at the time that it was done. But now it's a crime, 2 years later. So he goes on. He states, and I quote, "Bills of attainder, ex post facto laws, and laws impairing the obligation of contracts are contrary to the first principles of the social compact and to every principle of sound legislation. The two former are expressly prohibited by the declarations prefixed to some of the state constitutions, and all of them are prohibited by the spirit and scope of these fundamental charters. The convention added this constitutional bulwark in favor of personal security and private rights." End quote. This is very important. No ex post facto, because when we get to this point now where we're doing the ex post facto law, we're doing bills of attainder. So just to try to relate it to today, when Trump just recently he got acquitted, if he was convicted in the Senate, he is still technically innocent as a private citizen. It's not a real. It still wouldn't be a real impeachment. It doesn't even matter. But regardless, if he was president and he ended up getting impeached in the House and then convicted in the Senate, that is still not criminal violations. Then he would have to go through criminal court. The legislative branch does not determine criminality or not. That is to be determined by a jury of one's own peers, and there is supposed to be a presumption of innocence. That's just how our system works in America. Now in Britain, I don't know if it's still the same way, but I remember years ago it was you were guilty until proven innocent. Whereas here we afford the citizens of America with much more private security and private rights. So Madison, he states with great significance, he states, and I quote, "The sober people of America are weary of the fluctuating policy which has directed the public councils. They have seen with regret and indignation that sudden changes and legislative interferences in cases affecting personal rights become jobs in the hands of enterprising and influential spectators and snares to the more industrious and less informed part of the community. They have seen, too, that one legislative interference is but the first link of the long chain of repetitions, every subsequent interference being naturally produced by the effects of the preceding." End quote. So here what he's talking about, this is actually a pretty significant quote. He's talking about the people themselves. They're afforded the right of personal security and private rights. And he says the sober people, they're weary of the policy, how it is so, he says, fluctuating, it's so unstable. And this isn't our public councils. This is in, let's say you're in just a town in your municipality or your state. They've seen the regret and the indignation that sudden changes and legislative interferences in cases affecting personal rights become jobs in the hands of enterprising and influential speculators and snares to the more industrious and less informed part of the community. This quote is just so spot on. And it resonates with what's going on today. So you have people that are stupid, essentially saying, less informed part of the community, people that have no idea what they're talking about. And we have these legislative interferences. We have our legislative branch, people that should know what they're talking about. At this point, you don't know if it is malfeasance or it's nonfeasance. They're not aware of what's actually going on. They're not aware of the laws and the civil liberties of Americans. And they're the ones making the change. And regular Americans, I guess, that vote for these people, cases affecting personal rights become the jobs of hands of enterprising and influential speculators. People that are sitting there watching, and they are influential, and they know what they're doing. They're trying to enterprise off the people and the snares of more industrious and less informed part of the community. So they're playing up to their base of people that legitimately do not know what they're talking about. And this is very easy. There's a lot of misinformation out there, and everybody always deems it's the right because you have the Twitter fact checkers and you have the Facebook fact checkers or what have you, putting disclaimers on everyone's posts and suppressing them. I've seen a lot of them that are just so wild and so inaccurate. A lot of memes that just aren't accurate. There's this new one that I saw recently is Star Spangled Banner is racist because the guy that wrote it apparently was a racist guy. I didn't really read much into him. So what I did was I looked up the original Star Spangled Banner, and that wasn't the original title. I don't remember the original title. But the story is the guy that wrote it, I think his name is I want to say something Key, with the last name Key. He was taken by the British, I guess as a prisoner of war, and as he was on the British ship, he saw an American flag and he started writing. He's a writer, I guess. Then the third verse, and this was the original copy, what it said was it was talking about slaves and it was talking about hirelings, meaning people that were hired. And they were kind of making the idea where, okay, there's this war going on. These people, the hirelings and the slaves, they have to pick one side or the other. One will end in their demise, or one can end in their demise, one may end in their victory. Talking about the British side and the American side. So apparently the British were saying that they wanted to free the slaves when they were here in 1812, the War of 1812. Now, we were stopping the importation of slaves at that time. If you imported slaves, you got hit with a heavy tax and a heavy fine to the point where it was not even reasonable to do so. Now, this verse that's written here was somehow deemed as like extremely outrageously racist. And then if you look it up, you'll find Washington Post articles, CNN articles, and they purposely cut the verse in just a sentence or two so you don't understand the full context of the entire piece, so then it looks really racist. And that's really what my point is that you have, and they did this actually in the impeachment hearing in the Senate. They were changing the dates in which they were quoting and they were sourcing Twitter, and then they were changing the dates from 2020 to 2021. They were doctoring dates. And then they would also, when they went to play Trump at his speech that apparently incited violence, they were misinterpreting him. They were taking everything out of context. They were taking parts of his speech, what he was saying, and then they would cut it off right before he was saying to peacefully and patriotically protest, and then they would continue playing it, 10 seconds later. These are the things that they were doing. They doctor evidence, and the regular American person isn't paying attention to what's going on. And when the mainstream media, when there's 90% of information getting shot at you that's all one way, then that's what you are going to go and believe. That's what ends up happening over time. And that's what he's alluding to here. You have people that the legislative branch interference, first law, and their interference is with what he's saying is with, private rights, civil liberties. Whereas here, currently it goes that way as well, but it also goes to make you just hate conservatives and hate Republicans or what have you. But it's the same thing with the civil liberties. Now they're already talking about gun control. They're talking about taking common sense gun reform. So next, the prohibition with respect to titles of nobility was copied from the old Articles of Confederation. The founders feared nobility because of past practice throughout Europe and especially Great Britain. This led to violent factions and tyranny. So last of this class of powers is that no state shall lay duties or imposts on imports or exports, with the exception of what is necessary for executing its inspection laws. Additionally, any net of these duties shall be for the use of the Treasury of the United States. So that one's pretty simple. I've gone over that before. And he's going to state it here. And I quote, "No state shall, without the consent of the Congress, lay any imposts or duties on imports or exports, except what may be absolutely necessary for executing its inspection laws, and the net produce of all duties and imposts laid by any state on imports or exports shall be for the use of the Treasury of the United States, and all such laws shall be subject to the revision and control of the Congress," end quote. So at the very end, he writes that part where he means, now if a state wants to do it, the Congress can maybe work something out, but all imports, exports, all the money being taken in from there, it'll get paid the inspection duties, the people that are inspecting, the inspection laws, they'll pay them out, and then the rest goes straight to the Treasury of the United States. Pretty self-explanatory. I've talked about it before. So another provision is that no state without the consent of Congress keep troops or ships of war in times of peace, or enter into any agreement with foreign power or another state, or engage in war unless invaded or in such an imminent danger they cannot delay fighting back. These provisions are based on the before listed papers of federal power, reserving the right to tax imports and exports and keep a federal army and navy. So he talks about that a little bit briefly. So if you're a state, you can have your militia, but you can't have your own standing military in times of peace. And you can't really go and attack another country as a state, which in a state like New Jersey, you didn't really have to worry about attacking another country unless if they decided to come on the coast. You cannot do that unless if you were invaded or you are in such imminent danger that you cannot delay to fight back, which all makes sense. That's just self-preservation stuff. So the sixth and final class of powers is the federal government's, and I quote, power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States or in any department or officer thereof, end quote. So this one's pretty important. He goes very deeply into kind of the whole word soup of this and what the old provision said in the Articles of Confederation. But first, he asserts, without, and I quote, without the substance of this power, the whole Constitution would be a dead letter. And then he explains, necessary and proper is better than the argument for particular powers to reach the general power. So in the Articles of Confederation, the provision was, we give the federal government, we give the Congress assembled particular powers to reach the general power. Which is kind of convoluted. It's kind of confusing. So you go, what are the particular powers? Though you don't really name out what the particular powers are, and the general powers. What is the general power exactly? It's a little bit too broad, and then it also kind of narrow the word particular powers kind of narrows down the ability of the federal government to do what they have to do. And that's why he explains his provision he likes better, which is necessary and proper. So what is necessary and proper to the stability and the self-preservation of the Union? So he goes on to talk about this, comparing the Articles of Confederation to the proposed Constitution. He states, and I quote, it would be easy to show, if it were necessary, that no important power delegated by the Articles of Confederation has been or can be executed by Congress without recurring more or less to the doctrine of construction or implication. As the powers delegated under the new system are more extensive, the government which is to administer it would find itself still more distressed with the alternative of betraying the public interests by doing nothing, or violating the Constitution by exercising powers indispensably necessary and proper, but at the same time not expressly guaranteed, end quote. So that was another thing that was in there. Another thing the Articles of Confederation was expressly too, which is another really kind of weird word to use. So what he's saying here is he's just characterizing a situation where you're going to have a situation where the federal government is going to fail to act, or they're going to be hesitant to act because they're not given the powers because of this weird provision that says particular powers particular powers to reach the general power, rather than whatever is necessary and proper to preserve the Union. So he goes on this. He states, and I quote, had the Constitution been silent on this head, there can be no doubt that all the particular powers requisite as means of executing the general powers would have resulted to the government by unavoidable implication. No axiom is more clearly established in law or in reason than that wherever the end is required, the means are authorized, whereas wherever a general power to do a thing is given, every particular power necessary for doing it is included, end quote. So he's saying the idea of the provision it's not the problem, is the intent of the provision of the general power with the particular powers. That the intent isn't wrong, he says, but the way in which it's written is it can be misconstrued. It's an obvious axiom, he says, in politics, that wherever a general power to do a thing is given, every single particular power is necessary to doing it, and it should be included. But using the words particular power is really the issue here. And he's saying if no axiom, I think he goes on here to mention the Yeah, no. So he goes on next, which his objectors feared would be a usurpation of federal power, the provision to have all the powers necessary and proper. He goes on to explain their argument and then his rebuttal. He states, and I quote, "The truth is that the ultimate redress may be more confided in against unconstitutional acts of the federal than of the state legislatures, for this plain reason, that as every such act of the former will be an invasion of the rights of the latter, these will be ever ready to mark the innovation, to sound the alarm to the people, and to exert their local influence in effecting a change of federal representatives, there being no such intermediate body between the state legislatures and the people interested in watching the conduct of the former. Violations of the state constitutions are more likely to remain unnoticed and unredressed." So he's saying as soon as the federal government itself steps out of line, you're going to have, to begin with, too. This is another thing I think he states later. The people themselves elect all the federal representatives, the House of Reps, and then the state legislatures at this time are to elect the senators, and the people also elect the president as well. So whenever the federal government steps out of line, the people should be very quick to rebuttal them, which in a general sense, in some ways they kind of are. I think that we're much more centralized in our politics. Everyone looks to DC all the time at everything they do. Now, if anything is anything done about the malfeasance in DC, not really, but people speak out about it much more than they do in their own individual states. Individual state governments really get away with a lot of things. In this state in particular, tax rates are outrageous because we're paying crazy pension programs. We also have these ridiculous contracts with private entities such as like a PSE&G. We'll have these absolutely outrageous contracts with them where we're paying them big time taxpayer money, and what's happening is there's kickbacks being done with whoever negotiated the deal in the state or the town or the municipality, and that's just the way that dirty politics works, unfortunately. So next he goes on. This Constitution and the laws of the United States which shall be made in pursuance thereof, and all treaties made or which shall be made under the authority of the United States shall be the supreme law of the land, and the judges in every state shall be bound thereby, anything in the Constitution or laws of any state to the contrary notwithstanding, end quote. So anything, any law that does not, any proposed law, any provision that does not coincide and is actually contrary to the federal constitution is notwithstanding, as in it is invalid. And he's saying all judges should be bound thereby the federal constitution. So when you have judges, and I love the appeal to authority that always happens if you talk about voter fraud at all, it's always, the Supreme Court didn't take up any cases, thus all the cases are moot and they're all BS. That's actually not the truth, because And then the response is, the Supreme Court, they're smarter than us. They know so. It's the appeal to authority fallacy. And you also have people. So you have 4 of the people currently, or 3 of the people currently that are in the Supreme Court that voted 5-4 on Heller versus DC, and that's for individual gun ownership. It was 5-4, and Ruth Bader Ginsburg was one of them. She passed. So now there's 3 people that are in our Supreme Court that do not support individual gun ownership. And I'm not talking about, has nothing to do with, assault weapons or high capacity magazines, just straight up the right to have a handgun and keep it in your safe. And they're supposed to be, and these are the people that are the Supreme Court justices. They're supposed to be the highest court in the land, and they're supposed to be bound to the Constitution, but they're not. So, and that's when you take that oath, that's the point. You're supposed to be bound to the Constitution, and if you're no longer, and you prove yourself as not being bound to the Constitution, you should be impeached. That's the way it should go. That's what we should start doing to our civil officers. So next he goes on. He states, and I quote, "To be fully sensible of this, we need only suppose for a moment that the supremacy of the state constitutions had been left complete by a saving clause in their favor. In the first place, as these constitutions invest the state legislatures with absolute sovereignty in all cases not accepted by the existing Articles of Confederation, all the authorities contained in the proposed Constitution, so far as they exceed those enumerated in the Confederation, would have been annulled, and the new Congress would have been reduced to the same important condition with their predecessors," end quote. So he's saying if this provision was not there and it wasn't in existence, the idea that our representatives in states, as well as our judges, and everyone that's in government from the top down, whether it's the federal or the state government, the fact that they're bound to the Constitution, if this wasn't the truth, then we'd be in the same situation that we were in before in the Articles of Confederation, where we had states that weren't collecting taxes, we had states that it was up to their discretion, and they disregarded the Articles of Confederation. So that's the importance of that provision, and that's all he's stating there. So next, the Constitution and any law of that state that is not in accordance with this Constitution will be void. This was for reasons of uniformity in regards to treaties and federal law applying to all states equally instead of some. If not for the provision, Madison, he details, and this is important, he states, if it weren't for this provision, in fine, the world would have seen for the first time a system of government founded on an inversion of the fundamental principles of all government. It would have seen the authority of the whole society everywhere subordinate to the authority of the parts. It would have seen a monster in which the head was under the direction of the members. End quote. So he's just saying if this was not the case, you would have individual states ruling the entire country rather than the federal government and their jurisdiction. And this is what they're actually trying. The Democrats are legitimately trying to do this. They want to make DC a state. They want to increase the amount of electoral votes in because DC will be a state, so that'll increase the electoral votes there. They want to make Puerto Rico a state. Then they also want to increase as many votes through counting illegal aliens as citizens in our census. That will raise the amount of electoral votes in liberal cities and big liberal states. And they want California and New York to rule the entire country. And that's the point. That is the point why they want to also additionally, and this is the most important fundamental step and fundamental principle that they exude. They want the idea of a complete democracy, as in they want just a popular vote to win. And that is the point. They want New York, California, and I'm trying to think of another those are really the two big ones, the two big liberal states. They want both of them to run the entire country because their votes alone can easily sway an election in their favor. So they want those two states to render all the other states incapable, the other 48 states in the Union. And that's really their plan. That's their MO. And that's why, and it's just for winning. It's all about political power. It has absolutely nothing to do with principle. It's just straight up political power. If you change the voting system, at that point, we're really just not a republic. We're a democracy. A complete democracy that does not afford anybody inalienable rights. That's the point of a republic. You're also supposed to be directly representative of the people. And when you're going to have this federal system set up that isn't representative of the people because it only represents California and New York, then we're no longer going to be Republican in character. So next he goes on. He states, and this is actually a very interesting thing that I found here. And I quote, senators and representatives and the members of the several state legislatures and all executive and judicial officers, both of the United States and of the several states, shall be bound by oath or affirmation to support this Constitution, end quote. So you say, why is this so important? This is kind of just generic. This is general. The dissenters here, what they were complaining about is why is it that the several state legislatures have to, support this oath of the Constitution? So he answers. He states, and I quote, the members of the federal government will have no agency in carrying the state constitutions into effect. The members and officers of the state governments, on the contrary, will have an essential agency in giving effect to the federal constitution. The election of the president and senate will depend in all cases on the legislatures of the several states. And the election of the houses of representatives will equally depend on the same authority in the first instance, and will probably forever be conducted by the officers and according to the laws of the states, end quote. So, to begin with, to ratify the Constitution, this was up to the state legislatures. Thus, they should have to claim an oath to the Constitution. They should be bound by an oath. And that's the idea here. And then, additionally, at this time, the Senate was elected by the state legislatures of each individual state. So they had, the state legislatures had their own federal power in a way, but it was much on a smaller scope, and they had to bound together to create that federal power. And then also the president, because the election of the president is done through the state legislatures, which select the electors to send to D.C. That's kind of the way it works. It's very interesting. And then, on the side note, the House of Representatives are equally dependent on the same authority in the same instance, just meaning they're kind of they're dependent on the voters that are in those individual districts. So that was the reason for that, which actually makes a lot of sense, and I never really thought about it like that. This ensures the full effect of the Constitution pervasively and will ensure security in the election of those officials. Now, in conclusion, Madison characterizes the fundamentals and virtues of the Constitution. He states, and I quote, "We have now reviewed in detail all the articles composing the sum or quantity of power delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government, and are brought to this undeniable conclusion that no part of the power is unnecessary or improper for accomplishing the necessary objects of the Union. The question, therefore, whether this amount of power shall be granted or not, resolves itself into another question, whether or not a government commensurate to the exigencies of the Union shall be established, or, in other words, whether the Union itself shall be preserved." End quote. So, he's just asserting at the very end here that the real consideration should be whether the Union should be preserved, meaning should we ratify this Constitution, and whether or not this governing document, the proposed Constitution, the means justify the ends, or rather the means will reach the ends. The fact that it is a government that is commensurate to the exigencies of the Union itself, such as national security reasons, the general welfare, which really just all relates to national security, some commercial values, establishing post roads, a criminal justice system, a civil court system. Those are the real questions that we should worry about. We should not be worrying about the power as unnecessary or improper in accomplishing the necessary objects of the Union, because in the last 5 papers he pretty much debunked that myth and that argument. So that's going to be it for this one. I greatly appreciate everyone for tuning in. Please make sure you check out current event episodes. Do them twice a week. I'm going to be doing, I know I always have the weekend special, usually comes out early Sunday morning. And then I'll have one in the middle of the week. Like I said, I'm going to be cutting back on my Federalist paper podcast. I'll be doing 2 a week. I'll do one on Monday night, and then one on Friday night. That's how it'll go. And then I'll have the weekend special. And then in the middle of the week, whether it's Wednesday or it's Thursday, I'll be coming out with a current event episode. So I greatly appreciate everyone for tuning in. Please like, share, subscribe, and I will see you next time. Thank you.